roar of my tractor filled the crisp autumn air as I worked through the golden rows of corn, the harvest shining like treasure under the fading sun. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening on my own land until the screech of tires shattered everything. Out of nowhere, Karen, the head of the HOA, came barreling down the dirt path in her shiny SUV, ignoring every sign that clearly marked the private farm road. Before I could even react, she clipped the side of my tractor with a sickening crunch of metal and corn stalks. My heart pounded as her car skidded to a stop, the smell of burnt rubber mixing with the fresh scent of the harvest. Instead of apologizing, she stormed out, wagging her finger and blaming me. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. Karen had crossed the wrong farmer end this time. The law would decide. Asterisk, the sky that morning was the kind of soft September blue that only comes after a cool night. The early sun stretched long golden beams over the rolling cornfields, turning every leaf and stalk into something worth a photograph. I'd been up since before dawn, sipping strong coffee while the barn swallows darted in and out of the rafters. Harvest season always carried a special kind of energy. There was work to do, no doubt about that, long hours, heavy equipment, aching muscles, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in bringing in the crop you'd nurtured all year. As I climbed into my John Deere tractor and fired up the engine, that familiar low rumble settled into my bones like an old friend. It was a sound of progress, of putting food on the table, of life moving forward in a steady rhythm. My farm sat on the edge of a development that hadn't even existed 10 years ago. What used to be open fields and timber lots had slowly been carved into neat suburban streets, complete with manicured lawns, backyard places, and a homeowners association that prided itself on protecting neighborhood standards. When the first houses went up, I welcomed the change. New neighbors meant new friends, more local business for the feed store, maybe even some kids willing to help with baling hay. But it didn't take long before I realized this HOA was cut from a different cloth. They weren't just about mowing grass or keeping property values high. They wanted control. They sent letters complaining about the smell of manure during planting season. They demanded that I limit the noise of my equipment during harvest hours. Even though I was working well within county ordinances and leading every one of those complaints, like a conductor with a baton, was Karen. Karen was the kind of woman who introduced herself as the president of the association before even telling you her last name. Tall, thin, and always perfectly put together. She drove a gleaming white SUV that seemed to announce her arrival long before she stepped out. From the day she moved in, she treated my farm as if it were a public park she had the right to inspect. She'd lean against my fence and lecture me about community standards, as though my 120 acres of corn were just an unruly backyard in need of tidying. Over the years, I'd learned to smile, nod, and keep working. My father always said, "Don't wrestle with a pig, you both get dirty." And the pig likes it, but even patience has limits. That morning, though I wasn't thinking about Karen, my mind was on the harvest. The stalks were high and healthy, the ears full and golden. I guided the tractor carefully through the rows, the combine attachment slicing and gathering with a steady, almost hypnotic motion. Each pass brought the trailer closer to full. Dust rose in the crisp air, sparkling like tiny motes of light. I hummed an old country tune and kept my eyes on the field, lost in the satisfying rhythm of work. Out here, surrounded by nothing but sky and corn, the noise of HOA meetings and complaint letters felt a million miles away. That peace didn't last. It started with a faint hum, a sound that didn't belong to the farm. At first I thought it was one of the hired trucks arriving early, but the hum grew into a high-pitched whine. I slowed the tractor and looked toward the gravel road that cut along the edge of my property. A flash of sunlight glinted off a windshield, followed by the unmistakable crunch of tires on loose rock. My stomach tightened. No one was scheduled to visit today, and I knew every vehicle that belonged here. This one was unfamiliar. As the vehicle drew closer, my heart sank. The white SUV came into view, polished to a shine that didn't belong on a dirt road. Even before I could make out the license plate, I knew exactly who it was. Karen. Of course it was Karen. She was moving far, too fast for a road that bordered a working field. The sight of her barreling down the lane sent a ripple of irritation through me. But irritation turned to alarm when she swerved around a curve and accelerated instead of slowing down. Dust plumed behind her like a storm cloud. I reached for the tractor's controls, easing the machine to a stop at the edge of the row. Maybe she'd see me and finally realize this wasn't some suburban cul-de-sac where she could race her SUV without a thought. But if she saw me, it didn't slow her down. In fact, it looked like she aimed straight for the narrow path that cut between the field and my equipment. I raised my hand to wave her off, but it was too late. The impact was jarring. A sickening metallic clang echoed through the air as her front bumper clipped the side of the tractor. The entire machine shuddered, and my coffee thermos toppled off the dashboard, spilling across the cab floor. For a split second, everything froze. The roar of the engine, the rustle of the corn, even the birds seemed to pause in mid-flight. Then came the smell of burnt rubber as she slammed on the brakes, her tires skidding against the gravel until her SUV lurched to a stop a few feet away. I jumped down from the cab, boots crunching against the dry dirt. My heart hammered in my chest, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. The side of the tractor bore a fresh dent where her vehicle had struck it, streaked with white paint that left no doubt about the culprit. Karen flung open her door and stepped out like a queen descending from a throne, her sunglasses flashing in the sunlight. "What on earth are you doing blocking the road?" she demanded before I could say a word. Her voice was sharp and shrill, cutting through the quiet fields like a knife. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" I stared at her, struggling to keep my voice level. "Dangerous?" I gestured toward the tractor, the dent glaring in the morning light. "Karen, you just hit my equipment. This is private property. What are you even doing out here?" She crossed her arms, her chin jutting out defiantly. "This road is used by the community. You can't just park heavy machinery across it. Someone could get hurt. This is my farm," I shot back. "The road is mine. The signs are posted every 100 feet. You're trespassing, and you were driving way too fast." Karen waved a dismissive hand as if the posted signs were nothing more than decoration. "This area borders our neighborhood. I have every right to inspect what's happening here. We've had complaints about noise and dust. Frankly, you should be more considerate of the families living nearby." Her words were so outrageous, I almost laughed. She'd just smashed her SUV into a tractor during harvest season, and somehow she thought I was the problem. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that shouting would only feed her drama. "Karen," I said slowly, "you're lucky you didn't hurt yourself or me. You need to leave before this gets worse." But Karen wasn't listening. She marched closer, pointing at the combine attachment as though she were a county inspector. "This equipment is a hazard. You can't just leave it sitting out where children might wander in. I'll be reporting this to the HOA in the county." That was the final straw. I stepped back toward the tractor and pulled out my phone, snapping photos of the damage, the skid marks, and her SUV parked half-cocked on the gravel. Her eyes widened when she realized what I was doing. "Are you taking pictures of my car?" she demanded. "Yes," I replied calmly. "You hit my tractor, Karen. I need to document the damage for insurance and the sheriff." Her face flushed crimson. "You wouldn't dare. This was an accident, and you were blocking the road. If you call the police, I'll make sure the entire neighborhood knows what kind of dangerous operation you're running here." I ignored the threat and continued snapping photos. The more she ranted, the clearer it became that she believed her HOA title made her untouchable. But accidents don't care about titles, and neither do property laws. I wasn't about to let her drive away and rewrite the story later. Finally, realizing I wasn't backing down, Karen stomped back to her SUV, muttering under her breath. The engine roared to life, and with a spray of gravel she sped off toward the neighborhood, leaving a haze of dust in her wake. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the fresh dent in my tractor and the fading trail of tire marks. My hands trembled not with fear, but with the slow burn of anger and determination. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed like molten gold, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the photos. Every detail was there. The broken piece of her headlight I'd found in the dirt, the clear paint transfer on the tractor's metal, the skid marks proving her reckless speed. I knew Karen well enough to expect a storm of excuses and accusations, but this time I had the truth on my side. I opened my laptop, pulled up the county sheriff's website, and began filling out an incident report. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "Don't wrestle with a pig." Maybe so. But sometimes, you don't have to wrestle at all, you just have to call the right people and let the law do its job. Outside, the night settled over the farm, crickets singing in the hedgerows. The tractor sat silent in the moonlight, dented but unbowed, a stubborn green witness to everything that had happened. Tomorrow would bring another long day of harvest, but tonight, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Karen had finally crossed a line she couldn't talk her way out of, and the first step toward justice was already in motion. The next morning dawned gray and cool. With a thin layer of mist draped across the cornfields like a veil, I stood on the porch with my second cup of coffee, staring at the dent in my tractor from a distance. Overnight, dew glistened along the edges of the metal, catching the first hints of sunrise. Normally, the early hours brought me peace. The farm woke slowly, with the rustle of stalks and the low hum of insects replacing the constant noise of town life. But that morning my mind wasn't on the harvest. Instead, it replayed every second of the previous day. The screech of Karen's tires, the crunch of metal, her finger jabbing the air as she accused me of wrongdoing. The memory set my jaw tight, but it also fueled a steady determination. I had already submitted the incident report online. Now it was time to make sure it couldn't be ignored. I drove into town as the mist lifted, the familiar roads lined with fading summer wildflowers. My first stop was the sheriff's department. The building was small, just a squat brick structure with a single flagpole out front, but it carried a quiet authority. Inside, the faint smell of coffee and floor polish mingled with the sound of ringing phones. A deputy with a neatly trimmed beard looked up from behind the counter and offered a polite nod. "Morning. What can we help you with?" I introduced myself and explained that I was following up on an incident report from the night before. As I spoke, I laid out the photos I'd printed that morning, clear shots of the dent in the tractor, the paint transfer, the broken headlight shard, and the long skid marks leading to where Karen's SUV had stopped. The deputy studied each picture carefully, his brows knitting in quiet concentration. "You said the driver's name is Karen?" he asked, pulling a notepad closer. Karen Barlow, I said, trying to keep my tone even. She lives in the Cedar Ridge subdivision. She's the HOA president there. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He let out a small, knowing sigh. We've had a few calls from that neighborhood. Nothing major. But he stopped himself and gave a diplomatic half-smile. Let's just say I'm familiar with the name. This evidence is solid. Did anyone witness the accident? Yes, I said quickly. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He saw everything from across the field. He's willing to give a statement that'll help, the deputy replied. He wrote down the details and promised to assign an investigator to the case within the day. This is clearly property damage and trespassing. We'll contact Ms. Barlow for her side, but the photos speak for themselves. Relief washed over me like a warm current. I thanked him and left the station, the weight on my shoulders a little lighter. For once, the law wasn't a distant idea. It was a real force moving in my favor. But I also knew Karen wouldn't take this quietly. If there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was that she thrived on confrontation. By the time I returned to the farm, the sun had burned away the last traces of mist, revealing a crisp, cloudless sky. I parked near the barn and walked out to the fields where the tractor sat waiting. My hired hand, Jesse, a college kid who worked weekends for extra cash, was already there inspecting the equipment. He glanced up with a low whistle when he saw the dent. Man, she hit you hard. You're gonna file insurance. Already filed a report with the sheriff, I said, crouching to examine the broken light assembly. Insurance comes next. Jesse shook his head in disbelief. I've seen her type before. Bet she's already telling the whole neighborhood you attacked her. I almost laughed because I knew he wasn't exaggerating. Karen's gift for twisting a story was legendary. By dinner time, I wouldn't be surprised if she'd turned herself into the victim of a reckless farmer who trapped her on a public road. Still, I refused to let that thought sour the day. The harvest wouldn't wait for gossip, and neither would justice. Sure enough, around midday, the first sign of Karen's counterattack arrived. My phone buzzed with a call from a blocked number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice came sharp and unmistakable. I just received a call from the sheriff's office. She snapped without so much as a greeting. How dare you file a false report against me? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I leaned against the tractor and let her rant, keeping my tone calm. Karen, you drove onto my private property, damaged my equipment, and nearly caused a serious accident. The sheriff will decide what's false. You were blocking a shared road, she barked. That's a hazard to the community. I could sue you for putting me at risk. The road isn't shared, I said firmly. It's on my deed. The signs are posted, and you were speeding. There was a long pause, followed by a hiss of frustration. You'll regret this, she finally said. The HOA board will be hearing about your behavior. Before I could reply, she hung up, leaving only the empty buzz of the disconnected line. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and exhaled slowly. Her threats didn't scare me anymore. They were as predictable as the sunrise. But they did confirm what I already knew. She wasn't going to back down without a fight. The afternoon passed in a steady blur of work. Jesse and I loaded the grain wagons, maneuvering carefully around the damaged section of the tractor. Every time the machine rattled against the dent, I felt a fresh spark of irritation. Farm equipment wasn't cheap, and Karen's reckless stunt could easily cost thousands in repairs. But anger wasn't productive. Instead, I focused on the harvest, letting the familiar rhythm of labor calm my thoughts. There was something deeply grounding about it, the steady hum of the engine, the scent of dry corn, the sun warming my back as rows of golden stalks fell neatly into the combine. Late in the day, while Jesse drove the wagons to the storage bins, I spotted an older pickup truck bouncing up the gravel lane. It was Mr. Thompson, my neighbor and witness to the accident. He waved as he parked, stepping out with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His face was weathered from decades of farm life, but his eyes held a spark of mischief. Brought you something, he said, handing me the envelope. Inside were several photographs, each one sharper than I could have hoped for. From his porch, Thompson had captured the exact moment Karen's SUV rounded the curve at high speed. In one frame, you could clearly see the posted private property sign just before she crossed onto my land. Another showed the instant of impact, dust flying as her bumper made contact with the tractor. These should shut her up, Thompson said with a chuckle. You know she was yelling at me after she left. Tried to say you swerved into her lane. Never mind the fact there's no lane out here. I grinned despite the situation. Thanks, Ed. These are perfect. The sheriff's department will want copies. As the evening settled into the soft gold of twilight, I sat at my kitchen table again, this time with Thompson's photos spread beside my own. Together they formed a timeline too clear to dispute. Still, I knew Karen's personality well enough to predict her next move. She wouldn't admit fault. She'd deny, deflect, and demand until the very last second. That's why evidence mattered more than words. The law cared about proof, not posturing. My prediction came true faster than expected. Just after dark, a different number flashed on my phone. This time it was the sheriff's office. Deputy Harris, the same officer who'd taken my statement, spoke in a calm but firm voice. Mr. Carter, we've contacted Ms. Barlow regarding the incident. She claims you intentionally blocked the road and caused her to lose control of her vehicle. However, Based on the evidence you provided and a witness statement from Mr. Thompson, we're proceeding with a citation for reckless driving and property damage. We may also pursue trespassing charges depending on the county attorney's review. A wave of relief washed over me. Thank you, Deputy. Do you need anything else from me? Not at the moment, he said, but we'll be sending an investigator to document the damage to your tractor. I also recommend you contact your insurance company to start a claim. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair, staring out the darkened window toward the quiet fields. The weight of the day settled around me, heavy but satisfying. For years, I'd endured Karen's petty complaints and overreaching demands. But this time, the line wasn't just crossed, it was shattered. And finally, the law was stepping in. Later that night, as I locked up the barn, I caught the faint glow of headlights on the distant ridge road. A white SUV slowed near the posted signs before quickly driving away. I couldn't be sure it was Karen, but something in my gut told me she was circling, checking to see if I'd flinch. Instead of anger, I felt a deep, steady calm. Let her circle all she wanted. The sheriff had the evidence. The insurance company would handle the damage, and soon enough, her arrogance would meet the immovable wall of legal consequence. The stars glittered cold and clear above the silent farm. Tomorrow would bring more work corn to harvest, equipment to repair, but for the first time in years, I felt like the balance had shifted. The land beneath my boots was still mine. The law was finally on my side, and Karen, for all her bluster, was about to learn that not even an HOA president could outrun the truth. Asterisk, the following morning broke bright and sharp. The kind of autumn day that makes every color look more alive. The cornfields shimmered gold beneath a pale blue sky, the leaves whispering in a dry breeze that smelled faintly of earth and sun-warmed grain. Normally, this was the sort of morning that filled me with quiet gratitude, but I awoke with a restless energy I couldn't shake. The sheriff's call the night before had been encouraging. Citations were already in motion, but I knew Karen wouldn't simply accept the verdict. She was too stubborn, too convinced of her own authority. If there was any way to twist the narrative or slow the process, she would find it. After a quick breakfast, I walked out to the barn to check on the tractor. The dented panel still stood out like a bruise against the glossy green paint. Jesse had covered the combine with a tarp to protect it from the overnight dew, but the damage was impossible to ignore. Running my fingers over the scraped metal, I felt a mix of frustration and determination. Karen's recklessness hadn't just endangered my property. It had disrupted the harvest, costing me time and money I couldn't afford to lose. Repairs would have to wait until the investigator arrived, but every hour of delay meant more pressure to finish before the next rainstorm. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke my thoughts. For a moment I expected to see the sheriff's cruiser, but instead a sleek black sedan rolled up the gravel drive, its polished surface gleaming like a warning. The car door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Grant Lewis, an attorney representing the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. His smile was professional but thin, as if he'd practiced it in front of a mirror and never quite liked the result. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand I reluctantly shook. "I'm here on behalf of Ms. Karen Barlow. My client has concerns regarding the report you filed with the county sheriff." I leaned against the barn door, crossing my arms. "Concerns?" "She drove onto my property and hit my tractor. The sheriff has the evidence." Lewis gave a polite nod, opening his briefcase to reveal a neat stack of papers. "Ms. Barlow maintains that the gravel lane where the incident occurred is a shared access road used by both your property and the Cedar Ridge community. She believes you obstructed the right-of-way with heavy machinery, creating a hazardous situation." His tone was smooth and careful, but his words were nothing more than a legal smokescreen. I'd heard enough HOA rhetoric over the years to recognize an attempt at intimidation. "That road is listed on my deed," I said evenly. "It's private. The signs are posted every 50 yards. If Karen wants to dispute ownership, she can bring her own lawyer to the courthouse. Until then, the sheriff's report stands." Lewis adjusted his tie, clearly unused to meeting resistance on a dusty farm driveway. "My client is willing to discuss a settlement to avoid unnecessary escalation," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "If you withdraw the police report, Ms. Barlow will cover minor repairs to your tractor and sign a mutual agreement to avoid further contact." I almost laughed. Karen's idea of a settlement was a thinly veiled attempt to buy her way out of consequences while keeping her record clean. "Tell your client no deal," I said firmly. "The damage is already documented. The sheriff will handle it." The lawyer's smile tightened. He slid the papers back into his briefcase with a snap and offered a curt nod. "Very well. Expect a response from our office." Without another word, he returned to the sedan and drove off. Leaving a trail of dust curling in the crisp morning air, I watched the car disappear down the road, a slow burn of anger rising in my chest. Karen's strategy was clear. If she couldn't intimidate me directly, she'd send someone else to do the job. But if she thought a fancy lawyer would scare me into silence, she'd badly underestimated a farmer's resolve. My land was my livelihood. No HOA president, no matter how loud or well-connected, was going to rewrite the boundaries I worked so hard to protect. By mid-morning, the sheriff's investigator arrived. Deputy Harris stepped out of his cruiser with a clipboard in hand, greeting me with a firm handshake. "Morning, Mr. Carter. Let's take a closer look at the damage." Together we inspected the tractor, photographing every scrape and dent while Harris took careful notes. He asked precise questions, measurements of the skid marks, the exact location of impact, even the angle of the dent, all of which I answered as best I could. When he finished, Harris gave a satisfied nod. "This is more than enough for the county attorney to proceed. Between the photos, the witness statement, and the physical evidence, it's a straightforward case. We've issued a citation for reckless driving and property damage. Ms. Barlow will need to appear in court next month." The words were like music to my ears. "Appreciate your thoroughness, Deputy," I said, "but I have a feeling she won't take this lying down." Harris gave a wry smile. "From what I've heard about Ms. Barlow, you're probably right, but the law doesn't bend to HOA bot. If she tries anything further, call us immediately." After he left, I climbed back into the tractor, the engine's deep rumble settling my nerves. Work was the best antidote to frustration. Jesse and I spent the next several hours moving slowly through the western fields, the combine humming steadily as it swallowed row after row of dry corn. The rhythm of harvest dulled the morning's tension, but every time the machine rattled against the dented panel, a fresh spark of resolve flared inside me. I wasn't just harvesting crops, I was standing my ground. Around mid-afternoon, as the sun reached its warmest point, Jesse waved from across the field, pointing toward the gravel road. I squinted into the distance and felt my stomach tighten. Karen's white SUV was back. This time, she drove slowly, creeping along the posted signs like a cat stalking prey. She stopped just short of the private property marker and sat there idling, her tinted windows reflecting the sunlight like dark mirrors. For several long minutes, she didn't move. I could almost feel her eyes behind the glass, watching, calculating. Finally, the driver's window slid down and Karen leaned out, her perfectly coiffed hair gleaming like polished straw. "Enjoying your little victory?" she called, her voice carrying across the dry field. I shut off the tractor and climbed down, keeping my steps measured. "You're trespassing again, Karen. I suggest you turn around before the deputy adds another charge to your record." Her smile was brittle, the kind that hides a storm. "You think this is over? The HOA has resources you can't imagine. We can make life very uncomfortable for you, Mr. Carter. Noise complaints, zoning reviews, environmental audits, you name it. All I have to do is make a few calls." I met her gaze without flinching. "Call whoever you like. The law already has my back. And for the record, your lawyer's visit this morning didn't change a thing." That struck a nerve. Her face flushed, and for a moment she looked ready to explode. But instead of shouting, she snapped her window shut and sped away, gravel spitting from her tires. Jesse jogged over from the far end of the field, eyebrows raised. "She's not giving up, is she?" "Not a chance," I said, watching the SUV disappear down the road. But neither am I. The rest of the afternoon passed in tense but steady work. We finished harvesting the western field just as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in streaks of orange and rose. After Jesse left for the evening, I lingered by the barn, listening to the quiet settle over the farm. The crickets were just beginning their nighttime chorus when my phone buzzed with a new text. Messaged out, it was from an unknown number, but the message was unmistakably Karen's handiwork. "Withdraw your complaint or face the consequences." There was no signature, no proof, but the tone was pure Karen, sharp, threatening, and desperate. Instead of replying, I saved the message and forwarded it to Deputy Harris with a brief note, "For the record." Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked out over the darkening fields. The stars were beginning to pierce the twilight, each one a silent witness to the day's events. For years, Karen had treated my farm as an inconvenience, a blemish on her carefully controlled neighborhood. She'd sent letters, filed petty complaints, and tried every trick in the book to make me bend. But this time she'd crossed into real legal territory, and no amount of HOA bluster could shield her from the consequences. I knew the next few weeks would bring more harassment calls, threats, maybe even more visits from lawyers, but I felt ready. The land around me stood as it always had, steady, unshaken, and utterly indifferent to suburban politics. The cornfields rustled softly in the evening breeze, their dry leaves whispering a message older than any HOA rulebook. Out here, patience wins. The harvest comes when it's ready, and the truth, like a stubborn seed, always breaks through in the end. Asterisk, the morning of the sheriff's visit began with a restless kind of quiet. The sky stretched wide and pale over the fields, a soft wash of silver clouds rolling in over the horizon. I had barely slept, replaying every detail of the accident in my mind. Karen's smug face, the grinding screech of her SUV scraping the tractor, the splintering corn stalks snapping beneath her tires, it all looped like a stubborn reel of film I couldn't turn off. My coffee had gone cold twice before I even noticed. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept expecting this day to bring another round of arguments. But there was a sharper undercurrent, too, the feeling that something permanent was about to shift. I was checking the dent on the tractor for the 5th time when the sound of crunching gravel announced a vehicle approaching. I straightened, wiping my hands on my jeans, and stepped toward the driveway. The familiar black and white sheriff's cruiser emerged from behind the line of maple trees that separated my property from the county road. Its headlights cut through the overcast morning, steady and unhurried. A thin plume of dust rose behind it, curling like smoke in the cool air. The cruiser slowed to a stop at the end of the drive, and Deputy Harris climbed out. I recognized him instantly. He'd grown up just a few miles away. And though we'd never been close, small towns have a way of keeping faces familiar. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, wearing a neatly pressed uniform and a look of polite caution. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the cornfields like tiny golden rivers. "Mornin', Ethan," he said with a nod. "You filed the report about the tractor collision." "That's me," I replied, meeting him halfway. "Thanks for coming out." Before we could say another word, the low hum of another engine drifted down the road. I turned my head and felt my stomach knot. A shiny pearl-white SUV Karen's SUV rolled into view like a storm cloud on four wheels. It was spotless, as if she'd spent the entire night polishing away any trace of the accident. The irony didn't escape me. No amount of wax could hide the cracked headlight or the faint scrape along the passenger door. Karen parked with a deliberate screech of her tires and stepped out, her heels crunching against the gravel. She wore a tailored blazer far too formal for a Thursday morning on a farm, and her chin was lifted as though she were stepping onto a stage. Her eyes flicked from me to the deputy with sharp calculation, like a hawk sizing up a field mouse. "Deputy," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm so glad you're here. I need to file a complaint. This man," she jabbed a manicured finger in my direction, "recklessly blocked a community road with dangerous equipment and caused serious damage to my vehicle." I opened my mouth to respond, but Harris raised a calm hand, his other resting near his utility belt. "Let's start with the basics," he said evenly. "Karen, you're the president of the Maple Hollow HOA, correct?" "That's right," she said quickly. "And this so-called farmer has been endangering residents with his Karen," Harris interrupted, his tone firm but measured. "This isn't a community road. It's clearly marked as private property." I drove past 3 no trespassing signs on the way in. For the first time that morning, Karen faltered. A thin line appeared between her eyebrows, though she recovered almost instantly with a tight smile. "Those signs are outdated," she said. "The HOA has long discussed expanding the walking path to include this stretch of land. It's practically a public easement." I couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, incredulous sound that startled even me. "You can't just declare my driveway a walking path," I said, stepping forward. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I own every inch of it, and I've got the deed to prove it." Deputy Harris turned his attention back to Karen. "Did you receive permission from the property owner to drive onto this land?" Karen's lips tightened. "I don't need permission to protect the community," she said, her voice rising like a tea kettle about to whistle. "That tractor was blocking visibility for the neighborhood's main road. I was forced to drive around it to ensure safety. He left me no choice." "That tractor," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my hands trembled with restrained anger, "was harvesting corn. In a field, on my property. You had no reason to be anywhere near it." Harris exhaled slowly, his jaw set. "Karen, were you aware that you struck the tractor during this incident?" Her eyes darted toward the SUV, then back to the deputy. "That's not what happened. He moved the tractor into my path and damaged my vehicle. I have the right to press charges." The deputy held up a small evidence bag I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a jagged piece of white plastic, Karen's missing headlight fragment, the very one I'd given the sheriff's office when I filed my report. "We matched this piece to your vehicle," Harris said calmly. "It was found embedded in the tractor's frame. The paint transfer is consistent with a collision caused by your car." Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes flickered like faulty lights, struggling to settle on a defense. "That proves nothing," she said finally. But the edge in her voice had dulled. Harris adjusted his stance, his boots grinding against the gravel. "It proves quite a bit, actually. You're looking at reckless driving, destruction of property, and trespassing. That's 3 separate charges." The words hung heavy in the air. Karen's posture stiffened, her blazer pulling taut across her shoulders as though bracing for impact. "I'm the HOA president," she said, her voice wavering despite the attempt at authority. "You can't just—" "Ma'am," Harris interrupted, his tone sharpening like a blade. "The law doesn't care about titles. I need you to hand over your license and registration." For a long moment, Karen didn't move. The only sound was the faint rustle of corn stalks swaying in the wind. Then, with a sudden jerk of her arm, she yanked her purse open and slapped the documents into the deputy's waiting hand. Her eyes were icy as she turned them on me, but the fire behind them had dimmed. "Stay right here," Harris instructed as he returned to the cruiser. He spoke into his radio, his words low but firm. A faint crackle followed, then silence. Karen shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her confidence draining with each passing second. Minutes later, the distant rumble of heavy machinery rolled down the road. A red and silver tow truck appeared, its metal winch gleaming in the muted light. The driver stepped out, nodding to Harris before walking toward Karen's SUV with the casual precision of a man who's done this 100 times. Karen spun toward the deputy, her voice rising to a near scream. You can't tow my car. I need that vehicle for official HOA business. This is harassment. This is procedure, Harris replied evenly, handing her a copy of the citation paperwork. Your vehicle is being impounded as part of the investigation. You'll be able to retrieve it after the court date, pending damages and fines. The tow truck's winch clanked loudly as it hooked onto the SUV's undercarriage. The metallic snap of the chain echoed across the fields, final and unyielding. Karen flinched at the sound, her bravado crumbling with every turn of the crank. You'll regret this, she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. Do you know who I am? I'll have this entire department enough, Harris said, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. You're welcome to make your case in court, but right now, you need to step aside. Karen's shoulders sagged, her fists clenching at her sides as she backed away. For the first time since the accident, she looked small, just another resident standing on land she didn't own, facing consequences she couldn't control. The tow truck growled to life, lifting the SUV off the gravel with a slow, deliberate motion. The wheels dangled helplessly, spinning once before locking in place. A deep satisfaction settled in my chest as I watched the vehicle that had torn through my field rise into the air like a captured animal. Harris handed me a card with the case number and next steps. You'll get a call from the county prosecutor, he explained. Keep your documentation handy. Your evidence is solid. This should be straightforward. Thanks, Deputy, I said, shaking his hand. My grip was firm, steadied by the relief of finally being heard. Karen remained silent, her eyes fixed on the tow truck as it rolled back toward the main road. The engine's low growl faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of wind through the corn. Her SUV, a symbol of her power and arrogance, was gone. When Harris climbed back into his cruiser, Karen finally turned to me. Her voice was a venomous hiss, barely audible over the breeze. This isn't over, Ethan. I met her gaze without flinching. It's over when the law says it's over, I replied. She held my eyes for a heartbeat longer before spinning on her heel and marching down the road, her footsteps sharp against the gravel. The sight of her retreating figure brought a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since this ordeal began, the land felt like mine again, touched, unchallenged, and undeniably protected. As the last echo of engines faded and the morning sun broke through the clouds, I turned back toward the tractor. The dent was still there, but the air felt lighter, cleaner. The harvest awaited, and justice, real, undeniable justice, was finally in motion. The morning after the sheriff towed Karen's SUV felt like a completely different world. The air smelled fresher, the sky looked brighter, and even the rustling of the corn seemed lighter somehow. For the first time in weeks, I woke without the weight of dread pressing against my chest. The nightmare of screeching tires and Karen's relentless accusations had finally begun to fade. Yet even as I sipped my coffee on the porch, a quiet tension lingered beneath the calm. Karen was the kind of person who didn't back down easily. I knew she wouldn't let humiliation settle without at least trying one last desperate move. Sure enough, the day after the towing, a neatly folded letter arrived in my mailbox. The Maple Hollow HOA seal was printed boldly on the front, its polished emblem almost mocking me. I tore it open with careful hands, half expecting more threats. Inside was a formal notice stating that I had violated community standards by operating heavy machinery in a way that disrupted neighborhood safety. They demanded that I cease agricultural activity until an emergency HOA meeting could be held. Reading it, I actually laughed out loud. Karen still thought she had authority over my land, as if the sheriff's report, the tow truck, and the county deed meant nothing. Instead of replying, I made a different call to the county prosecutor handling the case. Deputy Harris had been true to his word. He'd passed all the evidence, photos, and witness statements along. When I explained the letter, the prosecutor chuckled and assured me that the HOA had zero legal power over private farmland. Let her send as many letters as she wants, he said. It won't hold up in court. Your property rights are ironclad. His confidence felt like a warm shield. I thanked him and hung up, more determined than ever to finish the harvest without fear. Over the next week, the fields filled again with the familiar hum of tractors and the sweet earthy smell of cut corn. My neighbors, who had all heard about the incident, began stopping by to show their support. Some offered helping hands, others brought coffee and pies. Old Mr. Thompson drove over with his rusty pickup and clapped me on the shoulder. You did the right thing, Ethan, he said. People like Karen need to learn boundaries. Their kindness reminded me that even in a world full of Karens, community still mattered, and it wasn't the kind she pretended to run. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to have vanished. Her SUV sat locked away in the county impound lot, and for once, the neighborhood was quiet. No unexpected visits, no screaming matches, no threats of lawsuits. But that quiet ended on the morning of the court hearing. The county courthouse stood like a brick fortress at the edge of town, its flag fluttering lazily in the September breeze. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of paper and old varnish. I sat near the front of the courtroom, my photos and documents neatly stacked in a folder on my lap. Karen entered moments later, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She wore a dark suit and carried herself with the same stiff confidence I'd seen the day of the accident, though there was a nervous flicker in her eyes. Behind her trailed a man in a gray suit, her lawyer, no doubt. When the judge entered, the room quieted. Karen's lawyer presented their case first, spinning a story about public safety and community rights, but the cracks showed quickly. The judge interrupted several times to ask for proof of any HOA authority over private farmland. Each time, the lawyer fumbled. Then, it was my turn. I presented the deed, the photos of the collision, the broken headlight fragment, and Mr. Thompson's witness statement. Deputy Harris testified as well, describing the signs Karen had ignored and the damage to the tractor. By the time I finished, the judge's expression left no doubt about the outcome. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant, Karen Whitfield, trespassed on private property, caused property damage, and operated a motor vehicle recklessly. The HOA has no jurisdiction over the plaintiff's land. The court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. Karen's face tightened like wet clay hardening in the sun. The judge ordered her to pay full restitution for the tractor repairs, cover court fees, and attend a mandatory driving safety course. When the gavel struck, a quiet gasp rippled through the room. Karen didn't move for a long moment. Finally, she stood, muttered something to her lawyer, and marched out without a glance in my direction. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon light painted everything in warm gold. Harris met me by the steps and gave a satisfied nod. "Justice served," he said. I thanked him, relief washing through me like a clean river. The fight was finally over. Back on the farm, the harvest continued under skies that now felt truly peaceful. The damaged section of the tractor was repaired with Karen's court-ordered payment, and each turn of the wheels across the field felt like reclaiming a little more of my own space. The corn came down row by row, and with it, the weight of weeks of conflict. Neighbors came by to celebrate, sharing stories of their own run-ins with Karen's petty HOA tactics. We laughed around a bonfire one crisp evening, the sparks rising into the dark sky like tiny reminders that light always breaks through. A few days later, I saw Karen one last time. She drove past the edge of my property in a borrowed sedan, her face pale and unreadable. For a second, our eyes met through the windshield. There was no glare, no finger-wagging, no threat, just a silent acknowledgement that the game was over. She drove on without stopping, disappearing down the road that led back to the HOA neighborhood she could actually control. As the final rows of corn fell beneath the tractor blades, I thought about the strange chain of events that had brought me here. Karen's arrogance had threatened my peace, but in the end, it had only strengthened my resolve. I had stood my ground, trusted the law, and watched justice unfold like the steady turning of the seasons. The fields stretched wide and golden around me, the sunset painting everything in fire and amber. This land was mine, as it always had been, and now everyone knew it. The fight with Karen would fade into local legend, another story neighbors would tell over coffee at the diner. But for me, it was more than a story. It was proof that standing firm, staying calm, and letting truth speak louder than arrogance would always win in the end. The corn swayed gently in the evening breeze, whispering a quiet victory. If you enjoyed this true-to-life showdown and want more gripping real stories, head over to Bright Reality on YouTube. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality for more incredible real-life battles and eye-opening moments.